On January 22nd, 2017, Kellyanne Conway did her thing and she blew up the internet. This time it was over the wonderful term alternative facts. This term it's crazy, it's new, it's snazzy, and we had a good time laughing about it on the internet. But her strategy of replacing old language with new language in order to circumvent old meanings is not new at all. And in fact, unlike the case of alternative facts, we don't meet it with resistance or ridicule. We accept it into our daily lives and we move on. Politicians constantly rely on language to alter policy and to define politics. So when language changes, so does politics. Have you ever learned a new word and all of a sudden you can't stop noticing it everywhere? Well, it's not because people are using it more often. It's because learning this new word has fundamentally changed the way that you're able to interact with the world around you. According to Dr. Antonio Benitez Barraco, a professor from the University of Seville, languages don't necessarily limit your ability to see the world, but it focuses our attention and perception and thoughts on certain aspects of the world. So many of the thoughts that we have are largely controlled by the language at our disposal. So the language we know and we use and their accepted meanings define the way we interact with our environments, whether it be social, academic, or political. And in terms of politics, politicians constantly are trying to portray the best image possible or to meet their goals by strategically choosing what language they use. And this often will mean replacing old language with new language in order to relabel a role or policy. And this strategy of political rebranding is very much alive today. Take, for example, people we used to call white supremacists, racists, and neo-Nazis we now call the alt-right. This is because over the centuries, terms like white supremacist and neo-Nazi has garnered up a lot of negative connotations, and rightfully so. So recognizing this, white supremacist leaders have simply rebranded themselves and adopted a new term that is free of the old term's burdensome implications. And by adopting this new term, they're also adopting a clean slate, making them and their ideology seem more acceptable to us. And the term itself has implications too. It's short for alternative right. And by calling themselves alternative, they're able to make their movement sound new, challenging traditional norms and deviant from the status quo, when it is anything but. America is built upon the exploitation and oppression of certain groups of people. And white supremacist notions aren't new or alternative. They are the norm. And calling it alternative is an attempt to erase this history and reality of exploitation and oppression. And so it takes us to the question, how does this truly affect the way we make political decisions? Well, we interact with white supremacists much differently than we would interact with the alt-right. And this has caused masses of people who once cringed at the word white supremacist to proudly call themselves members of the alt-right movement, justifying their influx in racist comments and actions with the guise of this new movement. And not only does it affect politics and the status quo, it also affects the way we remember history. Does anyone here remember the Tulsa race riot of 1921? Yeah, thought so. The Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma was once dubbed the Black Wall Street because of its primarily Black residency and its thriving Black businesses. However, one day, Dick Rowland, a young Black teenager, was wrongfully accused of raping a white woman, and white Tulsans invaded Greenwood, torching over 1,200 homes and businesses. A 2001 report done by the Race Riot Commission estimates that between 100 and 300 people died that day, and over 8,000 people were left homeless in the span of 18 hours. This devastating event, to this day, has been erased from our history books, and its erasure has been partially guaranteed by the language we use to talk about it. It was originally reported in newspapers as an invasion, which it was. But then this rhetoric started being replaced by words like race war or race clash. The words war and clash implied that the two parties were fighting against each other, when that was simply not the case. This was nothing short of a massacre. Except we don't call it the Tulsa Race Massacre, we call it the Tulsa Race Riot. What happened in 1921 was not a riot, and calling it as such is both a disservice to those that it has affected and continues to affect, and an attempt to erase the suffering it has caused and the oppression that it demonstrates. When we replace and mute language, we replace and mute history. And moreover, if terms like alt-right effectively replace terms like white supremacist or neo-Nazi, we would see in the history books what would look like a categorical change. In essence, if it looks like white supremacy is gone and is replaced by the newer, seemingly more progressive alt-right movement, then without context, it looks like things are getting better, when in reality, nothing has changed except the label that we see. And moreover, this veil of progress makes fighting bigoted notions seem less urgent, placing us in a position of complacency and affecting the way that we make political decisions. So, haven't you seen a politician worm their way out of making reform legislation because racism's over? This is political rebranding at its very best. Problems don't get solved. They just get a newer, shinier label. But this negative stance on shifting political language is complicated because shifting political language isn't inherently bad. Sometimes it's actually quite necessary. Take, for example, the R word. It was once an acceptable way to describe somebody with a disability, but we have perverted that word to the extreme, to the point where calling someone the R word is not just a challenge to their ability, but a challenge to their very humanity. We have rightfully replaced this word with newer terms, like disabled, or as Lorella Praeli, a human rights lawyer and activist, calls it, a diff ability. So the solution isn't just to simply resist shifting political language, but rather to be more conscious of the language we use. We must come to understand that both the accuracy of a definition and the accuracy of a connotation matters. And we must use language in order to humanize those that we have traditionally marginalized and, wow, novel idea, call things by what they actually are. So stop using terms like the alt-right or race war that only make hate more digestible, but also refuse to use old language, like the N-word or the R-word, that were once acceptable in the political realm, but should not be. And the media should take a level of responsibility as well. They should always indicate when they use shifting terms and define terms as well as possible in order to be more intentional. For example, The Guardian, an award-winning and internationally renowned British newspaper, has taken steps to reconcile with this problem. They have done this by indicating every single time they use a term like the alt-right and defining it with as much detail as possible in order to be as accurate as possible in their reporting. Overall, we must become more conscious of the language that we use, because changing language changes politics. Thank you.